Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. And this is the How Music is Made portion of our day. And it's my extraordinary privilege to welcome to the stage two friends, exciting composers, and the subjects of today's How Music is Made inquiry. To my right is Jimmy Lopez, and on my far right, Natacha Diels. So let's welcome them. You have in your program their biographies, but they're extraordinarily gifted composers, and that's really our interest in you, is your music. And so if you don't mind, let's just launch right into the conversation about music. And you have microphones in front of you, so if you would take those. And let's start with this, the most basic question, which is, I suppose, inspiration. How you get started from nothing to something. And you know, I'm reminded that inspiration has relationships with the words to breathe. It's, you know, to breathe life into something. And so how did you, let's start with Jimmy, you're right here. We're about to hear your piano piece in the afternoon concert. Can you tell us about the moment of inspiration? How did you breathe life into this piece?
So every piece has a different way to come to life, and I think Canto specifically, I remember the moment that I understood what a piece was going to be about was when I realized actually the title in this case. It doesn't always happen like that, but in this case, Canto is the Quechua word for cantuta, which is a national flower of Peru, and it was the flower of the Incas. So the moment I got this idea, the whole piece became like the process of germination, growth, flowering, of, you know, the whole concept of the flower. So, and that definitely inspired how the piece was going to be shaped, you know. And for every piece, as I said, is different, but also I like telling stories in a way. And people don't necessarily have to know the story behind a piece, but it does help me for sure structure the piece, you know, plan it ahead, and see an arch of development, musically and non-musically as well. Yeah.
That's such a provocative idea that the shape of the piece, the flowering of the piece is related to this, to a literal flower. So you've teased us with that. So can you fill that in a little bit? I mean, in what ways does the piece resemble this flower? And how did that actually inform the composition of the piece?
So the piece starts very quietly, and that can be conceived as, you know, when actually you witness the seed, and apparently there's no activity within the seed, but there is life that is latent within it. So then when it's watered, then you have the seed that is actually growing, and you know, it needs the elements. I mean, a seed cannot thrive on its own. It needs the elements, and that's when you musically you see this kind of unevenness and this presence of different kind of influences into the theme. So you will see contrasting elements or contrasting dynamics, meaning fortes and pianos and changes of mood within the piece. It's a little hesitant, let's put it that way. And then when the moment of growth comes, that's when you have, and the flowering, you know, that's when the piece really develops. It uses a whole range of the piano. The pianist, it looks like it has 3 hands, but it actually has only 2 still. And then you go and you finish, but as every flower, it has a moment of also death and decay. But its death and decay is also, you know, it's a cycle. It will give life after as well. And that is reflected in the piece too, but I don't want to give too much away.
I understand that completely. And you know, the interesting thing is that, you know, a lot of times people talk about what is the germinal moment for a piece. And you describe this piece in very, very real ways. We're not talking about germinal moment as a kind of metaphor. You're dealing with it in a very practical way. Natacha, the same question is going to come to you, but let's just take the point of departure that we just had with Jimmy, and that is a sort of as an environment. Because when I listen to your music, not just the piece we'll hear today, but your other pieces, what's so persuasive to me is the kind of sonic and theatrical environment that you create. So could you talk about the kind of the origination moment, the germination moment, and maybe fill in this issue of musical environment for you?
Well, I was going to answer this question a little differently.
Well, please do.
I typically actually don't know what my pieces are about until after they're done and they're performed for the first time. Or maybe I don't know if it's that important what I think that they're about until they're performed, because I feel like they really change once the audience hears them. And so I often have an idea that I start with for the composition of the piece, but it's really just something to focus my thoughts, and it's not necessarily what actually happens in the long run. As far as my more theatrical compositions, the piece that's being played tonight isn't one of the more theatrical ones, but the other ones are largely inspired by the Uncanny Valley, which is the intersection of robots and humans and this sort of creepiness line that comes in when a robot is too similar to a human. And that's been at the core of my theatrical works for the last few years. But I'm currently moving towards a more collaborative approach where I work very closely with ensembles to create the compositions. And in that way, I come with an idea, but then it completely transforms once the ensemble gets a hold of it and we work together on it.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the genesis, the germination moment of the piece we'll hear today?
Sure. So that piece is called The Colors Don't Match, and I wrote that piece at a time that I was also doing a lot of circuit building. And I had this interesting thing happen in my brain where I realized that it was impossible for me to understand how a circuit was working if the colors of the wires didn't match the colors of the alligator clips that were connecting two wires together. So, like if I had a red wire that was clipped to a white alligator clip, and then I had, the black wire going to ground, but it was connected to like a red alligator clip, there was just no way that I could understand what was going on. And so that was kind of the idea. I know it sounds like you could just work your way around that, but it was just impossible for me. I would just stare at it and I just couldn't get over it. Anyway, so that's where the idea for that piece came from, and it turned into this. It expanded into this idea that was sort of a lack of synchronicity. I was moving away from this idea of complete exactitude, which comes from working a lot with electronics, that everything is very precise, and that there's this element of precision that's more important than everything else, and I was really tired of that. And so I wrote in all these asynchronicities into this piece, and I realized that sounds a little bit different from the circuit building idea, but they're connected in some tangential way.
And so, Jimmy, I'm going to ask you a question about emotion, which is, having looked at your score, having heard a little bit of a rehearsal, this is emotional music. And how does a composer deal with emotion? It feels like it's, first of all, almost in some circles, and has been almost a taboo topic. And secondly, that a composer, unlike someone who writes words or even someone who dances, has to deal with emotion kind of through the intermediary of the medium of sound. It's like those radioactive gloves. You can't touch it, but you're touching something that can touch it. So how does a composer deal with emotion, and are there... Anyway, I'll just ask that question, I'll let you answer.
No, I actually think that we're tapping into something really profound and important, because one of the reasons why I got into music is because I listened to music that produced an emotion in me. I don't think I would have got into the music business had I not felt any emotion when listening to Bach or Mozart or Beethoven in the first place. So emotion definitely was a very strong driving force and the first impact on my first encounter with music. I also think that basically a lot of the music I write is very much linked, or at least in my mind, is linked to the moment I'm going through, a specific moment in my life. I don't necessarily allow what is going in my life to inform the piece, of course. I'm trying to stay also, impartial in that sense, and witness it from outside. So one has to have a protective, layer that one can actually look at the piece objectively and not get so emotionally involved. On the other hand, for me, producing emotion in the audience is a measure of success. And I do remember that at some point, I was writing some music that was making me very emotional, and I was playing it to other people who were not feeling anything. And I felt really frustrated. I was thinking, well, don't you listen, this is so beautiful. And actually, very self-indulgent. And then I realized that I didn't have the technique, I hadn't mastered the elements enough, the elements contained in music, to really convey the emotion that I was trying to convey. So I felt this emotion, but it was somehow crippling not to be able to transmit it. So for me, the first time that when I started to see that other people were empathic, that's when I felt that, oh, there's some empathy here. They are feeling what I'm feeling. And the more emotion I produced on someone, I felt I am finally succeeding in conveying what I feel within me. So emotion is a very important, albeit very hard to measure, way of, to looking at music and everything in life, but it's very important to me for sure.
Well, that's the mystery, isn't it, of music? I mean, it's clear that it's hard to imagine, although I can, and I've spoken to some musicians who don't feel emotion, or at least overt emotion, is a part of the art. But most of us understand that, when we were 6 and 7 and 8 and starting to listen to music, that we didn't dream of algorithms. We dreamed of this kind of like deep experience. It's just, what is the quality of transmission? I mean, in a kind of unrelated story, I very often when I write, listen to music, and I have had this experience of writing something that I thought was so profound, only to realize that no, it's just Mahler's Second Symphony, which is profound, and what I've written is pretty much garbage. And but I'm being brought to tears as I reread it. No, it's just the last movement of Mahler too. That is so great.
And what I want to add too is there was a moment in my life that I was very interested in Eastern philosophy, and I love this, idea of spirit, mind, and and heart, being united and working in harmony. And I feel that the great music or great art usually combines all of those really well. And so I don't think you can have great emotion without great intellect. At least I don't feel that way. I don't feel that it can be taken to the next level if you don't have that. So great intellect or greatly elaborate and complex music is beautiful as well. For me, it also has to contain this emotion. How that is conveyed, I have no idea. You said that and we said that's a mystery. But I have encountered, as we all have perhaps, art that is incredibly intellectually, very stimulating intellectually, but also hard to, to sympathize or empathize with. And that is something that doesn't particularly attract me, in just me. Although I have to say that, it might interest others, and perhaps it is beautiful to look at a score that is extremely complex. But if it doesn't produce any kind of emotion in me, I'll probably stay a bit aloof. So I as a composer, I'm not going to pursue that. What I like, and that's why my role model since I've been a child, is how incredibly complex the music of Bach is, but how incredibly emotional it is. And I find it hard to find, other composers that I can compare with Bach.
One of the things that your music always reminds me of is the ability to span several kinds of dialogues and several kinds of languages at the same time. I mean, the piece that we'll hear tonight has these aspects of sampling, something that comes in from the world of reference, pop music or noises. It also has pretty straightforward playing at times. It has these noises. It has a kind of, even though it's not an explicitly theatrical piece, watching Bill Kalinkos, the clarinetist, play clarinet and then pick up a mallet and then play a piece of wood, but not picking up a mallet the way a percussionist would, because then that means that he can't finger the clarinet. It has to be held in a sort of chopsticky way, and so there is that theatrical aspect. So it feels again like your music is this kind of negotiation amongst various references, and it's interesting then to hear your self-described awkwardness with reference to references, and I'm wondering if those things seem to you like moments of innovation when you find ways of putting things together that wouldn't necessarily have fit together otherwise. Is that what innovation means to you?
Well, I mean, just to answer the reference thing, I really love references. I mean, I'm really so delighted by language, and David Foster Wallace has this short story that he wrote about microdialects, or an essay. Have you read that one? Yes. It's just so great, and it's so true, that you have these microdialects that start at the very smallest level as the way that you talk with your family, and then the way that you talk with your friends, and then the way that you talk to an audience, or the way that you talk to your grandma. And those are all completely different ways of communicating with each other, but they all have this secret code in them, and I find that so fascinating, and I think that I really try to bring that into my compositions a lot. And then I'm also I'm a performer, and I'm a classically trained performer, and I've always been really attracted to virtuosity because I used to, all I did was play the flute for, I don't know, some embarrassing amount of time. And so I was really invested in this virtuosic way of playing the instrument. And so as I developed as a composer and I moved away from using classical instruments so much, I was still really attached to this idea of virtuosity, and I still am. Now I do a lot more performance art that's not so attached to the flute, but I am still really attracted to figuring out virtuosic ways of playing found objects or tables or my body or whatever it is. So I think it's those two things tied together. And then electronics, I just like electronics. I mean, I just like the way they sound. And I like the repetitiveness of samples. I like what that means to a piece. You know?
Innovation may not really be a context that you're working with, but how do you view that topic in terms of your musical output? Is there innovation? You've described your attachment to Bach. You've described your attachment to kind of profound and classical musical experiences. Where does innovation come into your musical practice, if it does?
Well, I do believe that innovation is essential. Absolutely. I mean, one of course cannot sit down to write thinking I'm gonna bring something completely new to the world, because then you face a blank page and you might face it for hours and then not go anywhere. You know, you have to have a starting point, and along those lines, then you will find ways of exploring something that is different and new. I don't like to repeat myself, so I do have very strong traits, and they are very present in my music and everything I write. But I like every piece and even every movement to be very different from each other. So even if something is not seen from outside as innovative to the world, I definitely continue pushing myself to doing things that are different and new for me individually as a composer. And I love composers who are, like, the last composer with whom I had like an incredible love affair will be like Jacques Risset. And I was fascinated with him, and still am, of course, but there was a period in my early 20s and mid-20s where I could not stop listening to his music. My music does not sound like anything like his. Yet he has actually inspired me a lot to push my own boundaries. And so whether I am innovating or not, though I'll leave that to the music critics and the historians, but I do feel that innovation, for us to really understand it, we need some historical perspective. And right now, it is hard to tell what is new and what is not, what is fresh and what is not. Also, I believe that history is kind of cyclical. So what actually can be seen as innovative right now could be seen as old and dated a few years from now. So I wouldn't be betting on the idea of sitting down and trying to write innovative music, because I think that will be a wasted opportunity. You want to write music, and we are composers who actually are coming from a great tradition, and we just are a part of a stream that continues. And especially if you're young and starting, I would never suggest, I'm gonna sit down and write something completely original right now, because that is just it's not the way it works, You cannot, or also, I remember this friend of mine who once told me, I'm just trying to get into all these competitions right now. And I said, well, but you're missing out. Why don't you just try to write, the best music you can? You're a great composer. I said, well, but maybe if I get to all these competitions and I win some of them, then later I can write a masterpiece when I have the time. I said, well, you cannot really write a masterpiece if you decide you're going to write a masterpiece. You really have to decide to write a masterpiece every time you sit down to write, and I'm sure not all of them will be masterpieces, but perhaps one day one of them will be. So yes, I think it is very important for all of us to continue pushing ourselves and our own boundaries. And luckily, we'll also be able to push the boundaries of music itself.
So welcome to the richness of the world of music, and welcome to the project of today, which is to take the music of Lou Harrison as a lens to look at newer ideas, not as a library or a museum where we don't bother to dust the statues anymore, but we're going to take the music of Harrison out and see if it still takes the corners. And the only way we can tell that is to put that side by side with the freshness of ideas even to the extent that they might disagree with one another, and to see what happens. So the project of imagination that is music, to say, what if we did this? What would it sound like if we did this? Could we put these things together? Is the experience that we hope you will have today. And it's really with sincere thanks. It's not such a straightforward thing to sit up here and share one's thoughts this way, and so I want to thank Natacha and Jimmy, and for both of your time just now, but also for your beautiful music, which we'll hear later today. And thank you, as always, for joining us in How Music is Made. We really appreciate that you're here. Thank you.